Okay, now for 20 minutes from a toxic feminist. I was diagnosed with a mood disorder after my fourth child was born. I come from a family with a long history of mood disorders. I often say that the lithium river runs wide and swift through my family tree. In my case, my mood disorder was finally diagnosed as something called PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. The way to think of this is just basically like you're bipolar for a week before you get your period. And I was lucky enough to live in the Bay Area, and there's a wonderful women's mood and hormone clinic. It started at UCSF, it moved to Stanford, and I had a great psychiatrist who treated me with a combination of therapies that were really, really effective in dealing with my mood disorder. So my treatment was a week of SSRIs right before my period. And for years, I was incredibly stable. Not perfect, but you know, who among us is? But I was really stable. My mood didn't fluctuate. I didn't have any kind of debilitating mania. I didn't have any kind of debilitating depression. But then I hit perimenopause. And I see in the room many people who are familiar with that experience. So what happens when you hit perimenopause? What can you no longer predict with any accuracy? Your period. Sometimes it shows up twice a month just for fun. Sometimes it's 3 months here, 40 days, 30 days, 20 days. And my specific treatment required me to predict with pinpoint accuracy when I was going to get my period. And the wheels came off the cart because I couldn't do that. I started to get more and more depressed. My psychiatrist and I explored other therapies, a whole range of them. Nothing was working the way I wanted to, and I found myself for the first time in my life becoming suicidal. And at first it was suicidal ideation, almost casually imagining suicide. And then one day I found myself standing in front of my medicine cabinet, evaluating the contents to see what would kill me most effectively. Here's a piece of information. It turns out that of all the various, my pharmacopoeia with all sorts of mood stabilizers and antidepressants and all sorts of things, and you know, I have 4 kids, all of whom have had their wisdom teeth taken out, so there were lots of opioids in there. The most dangerous thing in my medicine cabinet, acetaminophen, Tylenol. At that point, I realized I needed to do something, and I needed to do something fast. I had worked for, as you heard, as a federal public defender, and then I went on to teach at the University of California School of Law. I created a seminar called The Legal and Social Implications of the War on Drugs. So I had an expertise in drug policy, but it was from a criminal justice perspective. I taught and I wrote about mass incarceration, about the war on drugs, about the prison system, but I also was well versed in the universe of drug policy reform. And when you work in a field like that, books kind of come into your house. Sometimes you buy them, sometimes they appear. It's this magical thing. It's one of the best things about being a writer. And I picked up a book on that was called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. Now, I am not a psychedelic explorer. I never did. In fact, when I met my husband, he asked me if I had ever used psychedelic drugs, and I said no. And I said very authoritatively, when you use LSD more than 8 times, you become crazy. And he said, do I look crazy to you? So, but I had never done psychedelic drugs. But I found myself leafing through this book, and I read a chapter on microdosing. So what is microdosing? Microdosing is taking a tiny dose, in this case of a psychedelic drug. And a typical dose of LSD is 100 micrograms, not milligrams, micrograms. Then a microdose is 10 micrograms. And I was reading this chapter and reading about all of these anecdotal reports of individuals who had microdosed with LSD and found remarkable results in alleviating pain, in alleviating symptoms of depression, in enhancing productivity. The first time I read that, I'm a science-based girl. I don't believe things just because I read them. I'm not interested in fantasies about whether brains are different. I'm interested in the actual hard science. So I started to do my research. And I was terrified of LSD, right? I had heard all these stories. People who took LSD, they jumped off of buildings, they overdosed. And luckily, there's a tremendous amount of research out there on LSD. Why? Because LSD was discovered in the 1930s, and it was a tool of psychiatry and of medicine for many, many years. In fact, up until Timothy Leary, it was pretty much exclusively used by psychiatrists, by physicians, and a little sidelight by the CIA, which ask me about that later. That we can get into that. It's a horrifying but fascinating area of discussion. So there's all this research out there. I found out when I started doing my research that in fact there are only 2 verified cases of LSD overdose in the literature, and those 2 have actually been questioned. One of them is a polydrug overdose, and one of them seems to be a death of exposure. Nobody has ever been confirmed to have overdosed from taking LSD. It's so clear that in fact there is no what's called LD50. LD50 is a calculation you make for what is the fatal dose of a drug. LSD has no real LD50 because there's never been a fatal overdose. Well, that blew my mind. I thought people were overdosing all the time. I began researching the effect of LSD on suicidality. That really interested me. Here I was feeling suicidal. It turns out, now again, this is not causation, but a simple correlation, that the use of LSD is correlated with a decrease in suicidality. What does that mean? That when questioned, people who have used LSD are less likely than people who have not to commit suicide. That doesn't mean it's causation, again, but there's research out there that shows that. So the more I began digging into this topic, and the more I began reading these anecdotal narratives about the benefits of microdosing, I finally decided, you know what? I'm just going to give this a shot. I'm desperate. I'm a nightmare to be around. My incredibly patient, loving, supportive husband is being taxed to the end of his abilities. My poor kids are having to deal with me depressed all the time. I'm just going to do this 30-day experiment, microdosing with LSD. So I live in Berkeley, California. I thought, psychedelic capital of the world, I thought I was going to go out into the street and be like, hey, anybody got any acid? And it was just going to rain down on my head like orange sunshine. Not so much. It turns out that the Venn diagram of middle-aged moms of 4, lawyers, and LSD acid freaks do not, there's no Venn in that Venn diagram. So I looked high and low for acid. Nobody, either they didn't have it or they were like, no, not you, no. As my kids say, I'm incredibly basic. I'm the lady with the skinny vanilla latte wearing the yoga pants. You don't get acid. So eventually, somebody said to me, I heard about this professor somewhere in the Bay Area, and this professor, he's been microdosing for decades. Maybe he has some extra. Maybe he'll give it to you. I just thought, what nonsense. I ignored that. I kept up my quest. I talked to people who'd been to Burning Man. I thought that was a guarantee. Nothing. And then one day, I go out to my mailbox, and I find this little package. And it's addressed to me. It's covered in really old stamps, like the stamps a very elderly professor might have in his drawer. Like, they weren't even forever stamps. They were from, like, the 80s. And the return address read, Lewis Carroll. And I opened up the package, and there was a little blue bottle. He did not write "Drink Me" on a label, which he really should have. But there were instructions and a beautiful poem, which you can actually read in my book. And but I'm not an idiot. I'm not going to take something that shows up in my mailbox, even if it's in a cute wrapper. So I did what I always tell my children to do. I have a harm reduction approach to drug use with my kids. I tell my kids that I would prefer they didn't use drugs, but if they're going to take something into their system, they have to know exactly what they're taking, and they have to test it themselves. So I made sure I got myself an LSD testing kit. Where did I get my LSD testing kit? Thank you, Jeff Bezos. He sells them on Amazon.com. Don't buy your books there. Buy them from independent booksellers like the one out there. But you can buy your LSD testing kits from Amazon. Also toilet paper, because it's super bulky and takes up a lot of room in your car. Okay, so I got my LSD testing kit. I tested my LSD. I decided that what was in the bottle was actually LSD, that the professor wasn't trying to kill me or make me very small or very large. And I set out for the first time in my life to take LSD. So the first thing I did was I made sure I had a friend with me, because like I said, I have a mood disorder. The inside of my head is a place I'm terrified of. I imagined that if there was going to be one person in the world who was going to have a bad trip, it was going to be me. But at the same time, I had been reading all this research. I had been reading research that came out from NYU, from UCLA Harbor Medical School, from Johns Hopkins Hospital, research about using psilocybin to treat intractable depression. So what's psilocybin? Psilocybin is the psychedelic drug found in magic mushrooms, which I'm sure nobody in Aspen has any experience with. So psilocybin and LSD act almost identically on the brain. Why are they using psilocybin in these studies at NYU, at Johns Hopkins, at UCLA Harbor, and at Imperial College in London? Not because there's anything inherently different about the two drugs, and not because psilocybin is safer. In fact, there's so much more research on LSD that it would actually make more sense to study LSD, but because most people feel about LSD the way I felt about LSD. They're scared of it. It has a terrible reputation in the world. And psilocybin, people don't even know what that is. So these studies have showed remarkable results treating depression, not in microdoses, but in large doses. Though they're primarily using individuals who are facing the end of their lives, people who have fatal illnesses. Why? Because their depression is worse and more terrifying than run-of-the-mill depression? No, but because it's a lot easier to get FDA approval to give a substance like psilocybin to someone who is dying than it is to get approval to give a drug like psilocybin to someone who's not. So, but the results have been remarkable. People have experienced a dramatic alleviation in symptoms of depression and anxiety. So I read all the research again, I got my friend, and I said, okay, we're gonna do this. We're gonna try this 1-month experiment. I had my little blue bottle, I shook it up, I held it up to the light, even though that's a mistake. LSD degrades with UV light. And then I put 2 drops under my tongue, and I waited for the walls to breathe. They didn't. No kaleidoscopic colors for me. Remember, microdose. It's the whole point of a microdose is that it's so small a dose that you have no perceptual results. So then I just went to work. You know, I have 4 kids and a full-time job. I didn't have all morning to sit around waiting for, my head to feed my head. So I sat down at my desk, I got to work, and after about 90 minutes, I looked out my window, and it was springtime, and the dogwood tree in my yard was in bloom, and I said, oh, look, the dogwood's in bloom, it's so pretty. And it's not like the petals were kaleidoscopic, they weren't flying off of their own accord. No, I noticed that it was pretty. And I had been so depressed that I had been all but anhedonic for as long as I could remember. One of the features of depression is it feels when you're depressed like you have always been depressed. You can almost not even remember the periods in your life where you were not depressed. And there, suddenly, I was able to appreciate beauty. The month went on. Look, it wasn't perfect. I was not the magical mother. I didn't start baking cookies and, being the ideal presence at the dining room table. But one of my kids, when I asked at the end of the month for them to report what the month was like, my older son said, you were just fun. Like, I would walk home and I would open the door and I didn't have to do that thing where I wait to kind of take your temperature. I just walked in and there you were, and you were funny and you were cracking jokes, and it was just so light in the house, and it had been so heavy for so long. I didn't tell my children that I was experimenting with LSD. I told them that I was taking a new medication. And if you have a mental illness, you take lots of medications. I mean, there's a page in my book that lists the medications I've taken. It's a full paragraph, single space. So my kids were used to me trying new medications. They all said that this was the best thing that I had ever tried. They were, my husband was so happy. Again, it wasn't like I was happy all the time. But a little bit of that clotted misery was gone, enough that I could just be myself. And most amazingly, what I had was a little bit of capacity for introspection. So let's take this sort of as an example. When I'm on Twitter, it's terrible. If you're not on it, don't go on it. If you are on it, we can form a support group and try to get off together. Twitter is for the impulsive, what, crack cocaine is for people who have unhappiness and depression. It's terrible, it's terrible, it's terrible. But it's very addictive. So let's say you see a tweet, I see a tweet, it makes me angry, and I have a reaction like, that makes me angry, and then I have a thought, this is what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna say in response, and then I write a furious, eviscerating tweet in response. All those things happen instantaneously. Reaction, response, instantaneous. I don't even know that I'm feeling all these things. But during that month, it was like that loosened up a little bit. I would see the tweet, I would have the reaction. I would say, that's an idiotic tweet. But then I'd say to myself, well, that's awfully judgmental of you. Are you really? Is it really idiotic, or does it make you scared? Does it make you angry, or does it make you say threatened? What are you really feeling? And then I'd have the response, write the angry reply, and then I would say to myself, well, is that going to make things better or worse? That question, is that going to make things better or worse? Not one I was familiar with asking myself. It was a remarkable experiment. But I want to say really clearly, it was an experiment. It was an ad hoc personal experiment. And I wrote the book about that experiment, and it's also about the neuroscience of LSD and other psychedelics. It's about the history of the drug war. It's about mental illness. It's about my marriage. It's about all sorts of things. But I want to be really clear. What I'm calling for in this book is not for everybody in this room to start taking acid. Although, that could be fun. I still haven't taken a regular dose, so I don't know. But what I'm calling for in this book is research. For too long, drugs like psilocybin, like LSD, like marijuana have been lumped in this category as distinct from other drugs, and drugs that we cannot study, we cannot evaluate, we aren't permitted to look at. And I think it's critically important that we stop drawing these distinctions between these substances, that there really aren't any real legitimate reasons to make those distinctions. So what I'm asking for is research. We need research on psilocybin, on LSD. We need research to find out if these might be useful tools in combating depression and anxiety. Miraculously, my wish has been granted. After the book came out, the Beckley Foundation in London, which funds research on psychedelics, came to me and they said, okay, we're completely inspired by your request. Let's do a microdosing research study. So now there's a microdosing research study that's going to be starting in London. And pretty soon we may have answers to that question about whether microdosing does really do all the things that people say it does. Does it make them more effective? Does it make them achieve a kind of creative flow more readily? Does it make them less depressed? Does it alleviate pain? Or are all those results simply psychosomatic? Because I think what's most important when someone tells you stuff like this, like I'm standing on the stage and I'm telling you that this helped me, but you need to all be skeptics. You need to do the research. You need to look online. You need to Google things like men are from Mars and science and see what the answer is. Thank you so much for listening.